listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone. So glad you could join us today for our webinar, Planning, Executing, and Analyzing User Research. My name is Anita Sedgwick, Director of Marketing Sales at Usability Matters. I'm your host for today. This webinar is part of our series, Putting Users in UX. Just a reminder that the slides and full recordings from the 2 previous episodes are available on our blog. The URL is usabilitymatters.com, or simply type Usability Matters blog in your search bar. For those of you who don't know us, Usability is a strategy, research, and design studio located in Toronto. For over 13 years, global brands across a wide range of industries lean on Usability Matters for multidisciplinary approach to their technology, ensuring that their technology works for all their users. Clients know that we deliver user experiences that are elegant, scalable, and compelling. Another differentiator is that our team thrives in complexity and has a relentless dedication to finding the right solution. Before we start, I'd like to highlight a couple housekeeping items. We'll be covering a ton of information today, so I strongly encourage you to take notes. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to use the bar on the right-hand side of your screen. Simply type in your questions in the text box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel. Our team will be checking continuously. About halfway through this webinar, we'll pause briefly to answer any questions, and at the very end, we'll be sure to answer more and as many as we can. And for those questions that we didn't get to, we'll be sure to cover them off in our follow-up blog post. Now, we are recording everything so that you can review this webinar later. We will be emailing each of you the link so you can access the slides and the full recording. This will let you work through the webinar at your own pace at a later date. Our presenters today are Terry Costantino, one of the principals of Usability Matters.
Hi, everyone.
And Stephen LeMay.
Hello. Thanks, Anita.
A UX practitioner who has been with Usability Matters for almost all of its 13 years. I'm going to turn it over to Terry to get us started.
Thanks, Anita. So today we're going to talk about the steps in user research, and we're going to start with a little background. For those joining us for the first time, here's a quick overview of the UX process. There are 3 phases: strategy, design, and development, and research feeds into all of them. In episode 1, we discussed some of the key methods used during strategy, and in episode 2, we talked about methods used during design. And as Anita mentioned, the recordings are available on our blog. No matter which research method you're using, these are the key steps in the process: determining the objectives, writing a plan, recruiting appropriate participants, conducting the research, and then analyzing and reporting. And that's the topic that we will be discussing today. So we're going to start with planning. So that's the what, why, and how of research. So we always write a test plan, even if it's just a series of paragraphs in an online collaboration space like Basecamp. But more often it's a slightly more formal document called the test plan, and it gets approved before we start to book people and facilities. The main elements of the test plan are the objectives, as I mentioned, selecting methods and outlining the approach, the logistics such as location, device, timeline, etc., and determining the participant criteria and recruitment method. And I'm going to talk about each of these starting with the objectives. In the UX process, there are 2 main reasons to conduct research: to generate ideas, called generative, and to evaluate ideas and designs, called evaluative. During strategy, we generate and then evaluate the big ideas to decide what we're designing. And during design, we generate and evaluate the designs themselves. In either phase, your research might be mostly generative or mostly evaluative, but sometimes you'll include a bit of both. To get a little more concrete, here's an example of some objectives for a usability test. When we work with clients, we suggest they write down all the things they'd like to know about their product. Some are conceptual, like the first bullet in the first section: do participants understand the offer? And some are more tactical, like the first bullet in the second section: are participants able to understand the requirements for subscribing? We then take all the questions and group and prioritize them, And from this, we might suggest one or more methods that would best answer those questions. In terms of choosing a method, the phase of the project, as well as the objectives of the research, are the main things that are going to determine which research methods might be appropriate. And this is the chart that we provided in episode 1 for methods during strategy. And in the chart, we've included the description of the method, whether it can be used in person or remote, cost and time indicators, whether the method is mainly evaluative or generative, or can be used for either, and finally, when to use the method. So let's say your overall objective during the strategy phase research was to gather as many ideas as possible from as many people as possible quickly and at low cost. From this chart, we can see that a survey or a World Cafe would be 2 methods worth considering, and because they gather a lot of information from a lot of people. But World Cafe needs to be in person, it's difficult to do remotely, and it might cost a little more and take a little longer. So these are the factors that can help make your decision. We provided a similar chart in episode 2 for research methods during design, and both of these charts are available as downloads from our Usability Matters blog, and we hope you find them useful. So back to the test plan. Once you've chosen a method, we include a brief description of the method and how we're planning to conduct the research in the test plan. So that's, a page in the test plan. And then we also include information on the logistics of the research, where it'll take place, whether it's physical location or online, what devices will be used, the timeline for the overall project, as well as the specific schedule for the research sessions, the basic criteria for the participants, and how we're going to find them. And Stephen's going to dive deeper into the fascinating world of recruiting.
Great, thanks, Terry. So by recruiting, what we're talking about is getting the appropriate participants into your research and how to find them. So the first question to ask is, do you even need to recruit for your study? We conduct lots of guerrilla research and have helped lots of companies get rolling with their own ongoing research efforts that don't require recruiting a specific audience. But there are many research needs that can only be addressed with targeted recruiting, particularly in the strategy and design phases of projects. So, recruit when? When you are trying to gain a better understanding of your users or your audience is a particular time to think about recruiting. So in the strategy phase of a project, one of the aims of qualitative research is often to get a better understanding of your users. This research may directly inform your personas or your user profiles, which then become a cornerstone of the design process. Mistakes made with this early research can cascade through the entire product lifecycle, so it's essential for this kind of research to focus on your real target audience. During design, there are many cases where we are designing for specific contexts, for example, such as a business setting or something like a warehouse or even an airport. It's been a fun one that we've done some contextual studies in. So if participants in your research are unfamiliar with these contexts, they can lead to the wrong conclusions. Similarly, a person's role may be essential. Doctors have very different domain knowledge than accountants. This kind of base understanding or this base knowledge is essential to the work that they do, and it's not easily interchangeable. So, in the case of doctors or accountants, they're both highly trained, but they're trained in different things, and they're not so easily interchangeable. But a role isn't necessarily just a person's profession. It could be something like sports lovers, for example. We've done lots of work focusing on sports lovers, and while Terry and I were talking about opera lovers just before the research, opera lovers are not the ones you want to include necessarily in your sports research.
Yeah, I think the underlying thing is that almost every type of research requires sort of a motivated participant, one who would truly be interested in the thing that you're presenting to them.
Yeah, that motivation is really important. We often look at demographics too, things like language or ethnicity or age. All of these things can impact a person's ability to use a product or service. In a recent study, we recruited people who had not completed high school and who had at least one child under 5 years of age. We knew that the design had to work especially well for these people, and that if it worked well for them, it would also work well for our secondary audiences. People's ability can also be important when you're considering your recruiting. For example, whether someone is a novice or an expert, whether they have high or low literacy can impact your research. More and more importantly, accessibility is a consideration in the products and services we use. So when we're designing for accessibility, we know that our designs are going to lead to products and services that are better for all of us, but we can't assume that a service that is designed for some generic, vague notion of the general public will be able to support someone who, for example, uses a wheelchair or is partially sighted or whose grip strength is diminished by arthritis.
Mm-hmm. And we recently put an infographic up on our blog about the importance of accessibility. If you're interested, please go and see it.
There are several types of criteria to consider when recruiting participants for your research. We'll talk about kind of 3 broad types of criteria. So the first of these is the first level of qualification for your study. It's often a baseline criteria that all participants must pass. So an example of that might be if you're conducting remote usability testing, participants will need to have access to a computer and a reliable internet connection. If they don't, you can't include them in your study. You probably want to ensure that your participants are comfortable enough in the language of the study so that they can make a meaningful contribution. So if the study is being conducted in English, you'll want to assess whether or not somebody's ability to speak and understand English is sufficient to participate. And it's also typical to exclude industry insiders like Terry and Anita and myself, as we know a little bit too much about the guts of the market research process.
Too much behind the scenes knowledge.
Yeah. And I guess lastly, I would want to mention there can sometimes be legal considerations, such as the age of consent to participate. So if you're working with teenagers, you might want to pay attention to differences around the legalities of talking to 14 or 15 or 16 or 18-year-old kids. The trickiest criteria are often the ones that are unique to your target audience. Often these criteria are boxed with minimum and maximum numbers of participants to ensure that you get just the right balance of users. Sometimes criteria are easy to fulfill, like the first 2 bullet points here. Sometimes, like the last bullet point, the criteria can be highly specific. Recruit small business customers who have called the customer support line within the last 6 months was an example of some recent research that Terry and I did. And then after the baseline and project-specific criteria are met, a mix of demographics is often required to ensure a balanced roster. I think some of the factors you might consider here are gender, language, age, income, education, employment status, things like that. Technographics can also be important to consider. So somebody's comfort in or their degree of engagement with social media or their general web savviness, for example.
And just getting back to one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Stephen, about language, you can see here that while we want to make sure that someone can participate fully in the session with enough English skills, we also purposely look for people whose first language is not English, often in a very multicultural setting, because of course the interface needs to work for them as well. So just need to be careful about that language issue.
Yep.
In enough English, but maybe not exclusively English.
Yeah, so often we've asked people or included in our recruitment criteria a certain number of people for whom who speak another language other than English at home.
Mm-hmm.
One of the techniques we use for recruiting is to invite people to complete an online qualifications survey. Invitations may be something like an email invitation to friends and family and colleagues for informal studies. And email invitations can also be to a company's own customer list or to an organization's members list. You can also recruit or invite people to take a pre-qualification survey through any of the existing communication channels that a company has with its customers. Things like social media, or ads on the company's homepage, or a promo in the company's newsletter, for example. When somebody calls into your customer support line, you can even tack on an invitation to the end of that call. So once everything's around, the reason for their call is wrapped up, you can finish that by saying, if you are interested in participating, we'd love to get your input to help us make the product better, and then give them a link to the survey if they are interested. Now, alternatively to inviting people to your own qualification survey, sometimes a professional recruiter is engaged. Recruiting is a specialty service offered by many market research firms, and there are lots of reputable options. The key is to select a company with a large database of people to draw from. Regardless of whether you do the recruiting yourself or hire a professional, you'll need to turn your recruiting criteria into a set of questions. Depending on their answers, people will qualify or disqualify from your study. So here's an example question from some recent research we did with transit riders across North America. Have you used public transit with a wheelchair, walker, or other mobility assistive device? And we have provided multiple choice answers to make it easier to complete. And we have added instructions for how many of each group should be included. The idea is to ensure that we get some people who have experience using a mobility device on public transit, but not an overrepresentation.
One thing about these questions is that we'll often, we try not to lead the folks who are being screened with the question. So we try to make it so they can't guess what answers we're looking for. And that might mean burying, for example, the client's name in a list of other similar types of clients, and knowing that you are only, say, recruiting for that specific client. So there's lots of techniques there.
Yep. If you're recruiting for research, you're most likely going to have to offer incentives in exchange for people's time. Usually it's a cash incentive or cash equivalent, like a gift card, but in less formal guerrilla studies, baked goods can be very effective incentives. Love these donuts.
Yeah, I'm sorry that we're showing them to you at the lunch hour.
Yeah, good point.
In some cases, incentives may not be necessary at all. For example, we recently conducted several rounds of research with a regional airline, and we were able to speak with people in the waiting lounge. Speaking with us was a pleasant diversion from the tedium of waiting for their flight, and no incentive was required. Sometimes incentives may actually not be allowed. So an example of that would be a public institution that has policies that prohibit paying their members for any advice. In cases like this, you might find other ways around it, such as marketing swag like coffee mugs or book bags that may be offered instead. In other cases, a higher incentive can be required because it can be difficult to entice certain specific audiences to participate. When we have recruited doctors or senior executives, for example, we've sometimes had to offer higher incentives to make it worth their time to participate.
And with these kind of folks too, sometimes the fact that that's the type of people you're trying to attract might constrain what methods would be appropriate. So for example, we did one with lawyers some years ago now, and to get more than 20 minutes on the phone with a lawyer is a big deal. So that's what we did, and we just made the best of our 20 minutes.
So once you have people who have qualified using your screener or your survey, there's a bunch of other things that you'll need to get organized as part of the recruiting. First of all, they need to be scheduled. You'll need to get things like their contact information so you can stay in touch with them and give them updates. You'll need to give them an overview of what they should expect in the research and any instructions they'll need to follow. So that could be links to join for a remote session, or directions to a facility or to your office, those kinds of things. And then very often there are things like a non-disclosure agreement that needs to be agreed to. And we typically also pair with that an agreement to be recorded, a consent agreement for the recording. It's also really handy to summarize all of this information, all of the participants' particulars, and along with their answers to your qualification survey, and have that handy throughout the research. There are all kinds of times where you want to just refer to, how did this person answer that particular question? Or somebody who's observing will be curious about what somebody's background is when they start.
Yeah, and it also helps you keep them straight after 7 or 8 sessions.
Yes.
Okay, we actually have a couple of questions that have come in. Sarah would really like to know, apparently they're always looking for kids to play test their games. The pool of employee kids have been exhausted.
Fair enough, yeah.
So where could Sarah recruit kids in varying target age demos?
So what we've done is we've actually recruited parents. And then made one of the criteria, do you have kids in this age group, and then maybe an expansion to, and would you be willing to bring them along, sort of thing. So we've mostly done them in like little groups, like one parent with one child or one with 2 children, right?
Yep. There are other occasions where there's, for example, a story time program at a local library where we might go and observe how the kids are interacting with the permission of the library and the caregivers before we actually begin the observation. That's an observational kind of research.
So there's no formal recruiting process?
Well, you could go through a formal recruit with a recruiter, but I would imagine that you're going to have additional levels of guardianship agreements and legality.
Which is actually a good thing,
yeah.
to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons we use a professional recruiter on many of our projects is because they are part of professional associations that ensure that we are interacting appropriately and protecting people's personal information appropriately. So, I would say, professional recruiters for sure, one avenue. And then the other thing would be a less formal thing, like maybe being if you're part of an online discussion group, a parental group, a mommy's group, as they're often called, you can just send out the word that you're looking for parent-child combinations of a certain kind, and the word can spread.
One other question came in around legalities of talking to people under 18. Do either of you have any insights or ideas around what happens around that?
We haven't had to do that exact age group recently, and I think that's one of the reasons Stephen sort of said it's important to look in, because is it 14, is it 16, is it 18? It might depend on the kind of session you're having as well.
It's also going to depend on where you are and where you're doing the research.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's definitely an important consideration. And there's what's legal, and then also what you think is appropriate and comfortable.
Sure.
And those two things aren't always exactly the same thing. We did one some years ago where it was right on the border. I think the kids were about 14 to 16, and we had the agreement of the parent to come with them. And they didn't stay in the room with them during this. Actually, in the end, we did decide that they could. It was up to the parent and child whether the parent would stay in the room. So it's just thinking it through too. I think being sensitive to the situation and the kind of research. Even more complicated when it's online. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Another question, recruiting can take some time. How do you keep it efficient?
Great question. So for professional recruiting, we try to give them a minimum of about 10 days. So crossing a couple of weekends is our rule of thumb. And that's not too bad, because that's probably how much time the rest of the planning will take. So we just try to get recruiting started as soon as possible. Even if it's not professional, it takes some time.
It does.
Yeah.
So any research planning and execution is going to take some time. So we've actually put together a little bit of a checklist to help keep organized when conducting this research. And we'll talk about that in a short bit, because that's something we're going to provide at the end of the session.
Okay, perfect. All right.
Great. Okay. So on to conducting, also known as executing. We've used both of those words. And in qualitative research, such as the types that we're talking about in this series, the planning that I talked about earlier is about preparing for a useful dialogue with participants. That's really the mindset. So when you write a research guide, it might be a script or a survey. There's all kinds of different approaches. You know, that research guide might be for a focus group, who knows? And you want to write enough to guide the conversation, but not too much. The purpose is ultimately to get the participants engaged in talking. And so we always start with a few easy questions that they're well familiar with the answers, sort of get them warmed up. And then we guide them through the tasks and activities. Again, you know, getting them to talk aloud if it's usability testing, or giving them open fields if it's a survey, whatever. Just giving them an opportunity to express themselves. And then we also keep a list of probes handy for each activity. And we only use these when we need them. And the point here is that often you've asked one question and participants have kind of anticipated, in a sense, your next question. And what's important is not to be like slavish to your script. You want to be listening the whole time so that you don't make folks repeat themselves. And you're trying to get them engaged in a conversation, and you need to demonstrate that you're equally engaged in that conversation. So you need to be really present. So once you've written the script and you've practiced a few times, it's more about keeping it in the back of your mind and not being slavish to it, as I mentioned. We also always do at least one pilot session for all kinds of research methods, using people who aren't involved in the research. And that might be getting your colleagues to complete a survey that you've done, 3 or 4 or more people if you can, and then give you some feedback on where it might have been a bit confusing or difficult. Or running even a pilot focus group, which we did recently with our own colleagues, because we were doing a major study and we wanted to make sure that that what we had in mind was really going to get at the objectives that we had. And every method involves some kind of setup. So that might be making sure there's tables and chairs in the room or whatever it might be. But sometimes we need tools for conducting the research. So for remote usability testing, we often use Adobe Connect. You can use something like we're using today, GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar. And we almost always want to record the session in at least one way. So we sometimes use Adobe Connect for that purpose. We also use a software called Silverback. And all of these might be used whether we're remote or in the room together. If you're doing a survey, you might use a software like SurveyMonkey or a Canadian alternative called Fluid Surveys. And here what you'll want to do is monitor the progress through that software. See how the responses are coming in, etc.
And you can really notice if somebody's dropped off after question 3 or a number of people have, you might have a need to go in and tweak a particular question because people are tripping over it.
Exactly right, yeah. We also clarify the roles early on in the project. So who's going to be the facilitator who guides the participants? And sometimes there might be multiple facilitators like we do in World Cafe. The analyst uses, then there's the analyst role, and that person usually focuses on what the participant is doing, or the participants are doing. And the note taker focuses more on what the participants are saying. And then there are observers, often from the project team, which is great for bringing the research findings to life. Then you need to test that entire setup, and we also often do this alongside doing the pilot session. Seems like the perfect time to get all the ducks in a row. So sometimes the setup's quite simple. It might just be paper, pens, flip charts, and other times it's a bit more complex. So this is a setup for recording and observing a usability test on a smartphone or a tablet. And recently we used this setup and started by having the participants hold the device naturally. And we were finding that the observers were having a tough time really seeing what was going on. So we asked participants to hold the, in this case it was a smartphone slightly differently, which wasn't exactly natural, but they adjusted to it quite quickly, and it made all the difference for the observers as well as the recording. So again, testing that setup and not being afraid to adjust is important. So the facilitator works with one person or a group on a series of tasks or activities, depending on the method chosen. In every case, the facilitator's role is to get everyone warmed up, to guide the tasks, get the participants to talk, to listen carefully to the participants, to use probes to get more information, and also to let the objectives guide you. So the facilitator's often been involved in helping set those objectives and write that script. So all those things need to be in the back of your mind, because ultimately it's the objectives that need to guide you. And so here's a typical research lab setup with several people in the observation room, and then the participant and facilitator on the other side of the one-way mirror. So facilitation is one of those things that really anyone can learn to do, but it takes some time, effort, and experience to get really great at it. So when you're learning to facilitate, it's useful to work alongside someone with more experience. We've mentored some of our clients on this, having them watch a few sessions with one of us facilitating, and then watching them do a few sessions and providing some feedback after.
Before we leave this image, I wanted to mention there's one other role that we often involve in when we're doing research in a setup like this. We have taken to calling that role the wrangler. That's the person whose role it is to help guide the observers through the session, let them know what to expect, so that the fellow on the far left here doesn't jump in and start changing the code after watching one person have one problem. Manage expectations. So the fellow in the center here may be showing real frustration, but it might be too early to show that frustration. So this wrangler is the person to help guide people's expectations.
Another name for it might be the interpreter. So they help interpret what's going on and gather additional feedback too, which is important. So some types of research require monitoring really more than facilitating, like surveys, like I mentioned earlier. It's good to watch the first few responses roll in and see whether you're getting the type of input that you expected. And for online threaded discussions, you're kind of doing both. The facilitator usually has some planned interventions, like asking the group to provide feedback on a particular page design, but also has to monitor the discussion and maybe set some time aside daily in that role to provide maybe clarification on something or to chime in with additional probes to get more information. And then finally, recording. So when it comes to recording, we use a wide range of approaches like the ones listed here. And we sometimes use multiple methods within one research session. What's important is clearly thinking about the format of the stuff that your research is going to generate and what you're going to do with it. And that's what Stephen's going to talk about next.
All right. So that stuff goes into analyzing. And here's an example of a whole lot of that stuff. So regardless of your research method, your outcome will be some form of data. Here we're looking at the output from a World Cafe session, and that data is in the form of sticky notes, lots and lots of sticky notes. We started off by organizing the data by topic, and each color is a different topic. So regardless of how you've captured that data, you'll need to sift through it looking for common themes or patterns. In the case of the sticky notes here, we shuffled them around until they were grouped into logical themes. And out of this analysis came a broad set of features and requirements. And the wonderful thing is that all of it tied directly back to the people who participated in the research. When you do this, you may end up with outliers, things that don't group nicely with other things. And it's good to examine these before just dismissing them outright. They can represent some interesting insights a new business opportunity perhaps. But in general, you're looking for ideas or issues that crop up repeatedly. Other research methods will result in different types of data. Often that data is in the form of notes. We're particularly fond of an app called PairNote because it synchronizes your typed notes and the audio recording of the session. It allows you to play back the recording at a higher speed if you wish, and further flesh out your notes and retain that synchronization. And because you've got that synchronization, you can do things like search for specific words in the text and then listen to the corresponding audio. Often you'll remember that someone said something really interesting about a particular topic, or you might, when you're taking your notes during the research, type in "great quote" and then go back to that in PairNote and listen to it and flesh it out. PairNote lets you zoom right into those things. Spreadsheets can be really useful too in your analysis. In this particular case, we have notes from a usability test with the participants' names along the top and the topics or tasks along the side. This format is great for comparing findings across different participants or different groups. Some of the tools that you may use can go even further in helping you analyze your results. Online services like Optimal Sort for card sorting or SurveyMonkey for surveys, obviously, can present your data visually, which is a great help for not only finding the patterns that you're looking for, but also for reporting on those findings and the recommendations that you're going to make. One of the keys to ensuring that your research is taken to heart by the whole team is by keeping everyone involved. Not just the researchers, but people like the product manager, the designers, the coders, even the project managers. If they have participated in a meaningful way, the team members will take ownership of the findings and the recommendations. And one of the best ways to achieve this is to debrief with the full team as soon as possible after the research is completed. Give team members the opportunity to reflect on what they have observed and discuss and prioritize some of the key findings together. The goal is not to jump past the deeper analysis. It's about establishing a shared understanding before the findings and the recommendations land on everyone's desk. Reporting research findings is something that varies pretty widely depending on the needs of the given project. Some projects will require an in-depth formal report, complete with executive summary, detailed findings, transcripts of the sessions, and numerous appendices. But the last thing you want is for your beautiful report to sit on a shelf somewhere, ignored and gathering dust. So keep your report as light as possible for meeting your team's needs, is the recommendation we would always offer. If all you need is a summary presentation with some great quotations and highlight clips, do that and no more. Throw in some charts like those from SurveyMonkey or Optimal Sort and keep the prose to a minimum. Regardless of how formal or informal the report is, that report is going to need a framework. Smashing Magazine has published this Elements of Mobile User Experience framework, and it can be quite versatile with each of the sections listed in the circle there being a section in your report. Sometimes, however, this may just be a little bit more framework than you need, and often when we're reporting on usability testing, for example, our framework consists of global issues, the things that impact the overall user experience, and local issues, things that impact the UX on a page or a screen level, very small level, local things.
And the objectives can be essentially a built-in framework. That's another way we often structure our reports, or even the tasks themselves in the order that they were done in. So there are plenty of ways to get at the right material.
There are lots of things to remember when planning, and this is the checklist I mentioned a little earlier. it's a handy 2-page checklist, roughly in chronological order, and it should hopefully help you keep organized and on top of things throughout your study. The checklist will be available as a download following the webinar, and then Anita's going to tell you how to get your hands on it.
Okay, great. Stephen, thank you so much. That downloadable piece should be really handy, and I hope that the folks that have attended get a chance to use that. All right, we do have a handful of questions that have come through. Okay, any recommendations for professional recruiters? That's quite specific to local.
It is.
Yeah.
So we'll use different recruiters depending on where we're doing the research.
Yeah, right.
It really depends on where you are. But there are large national marketing firms that have local chapters in major cities across North America.
So what would they typically do in search? If you go to Google, search
market research.
Market research.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the place to start.
Sure.
Polling
Okay.
would be another one.
Okay. All right. What percentage of this? Let's take a look. All right. So how do you know when to stop the research and how much information is enough? It's a great question.
It is a great question.
And usually it's one that we consider at the very beginning because it's part of the plan. We plan for a certain amount of research, and typically only if we find something really fascinating out of left field would we adjust that and launch off into further or deeper or different research.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we would, as part of our report, suggest further research. That's not unusual. But as Stephen says, we know how much time, contact time we can have with people, and so we keep that in mind. So, for example, we find that working one-on-one with someone for more than an hour is quite exhausting for them. It's really much like they're on. It's a bit of a performance, and so we find that we try not to have our sessions, one-on-one sessions, be more than an hour. Focus groups or World Cafes, we're talking about maybe 90 minutes to 2 hours, again, being cognizant of people's time. And then we've already planned how many of those sessions and how to decide how many sessions. There's a bunch of factors, but one might be how many activities do you have, because it won't all fit into an hour, or it might be that we need representation across the country, and that we're not going to be able to do that if we only do it with 8 people or 10 people.
Yep.
So there's a bunch of factors that go into that. So yeah, it's more about the pre-planning and then knowing the objectives.
Yeah, there are some sort of starting, guidelines. We might hold our thumb up in the air and say, well, we think for this kind of usability testing, we'll probably need 8 to 10 participants. That's enough.
Mm-hmm.
Or because we've got multiple user groups that are wildly distinctive, we might double that. We might know, for example, in a focus group kind of session, we might want 5 to 8 people per session, and that can. We would expand that perhaps to fit the budget. So the budget's another constraining factor on how big the research gets.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just have this amount of time or this amount of money budgeted, and that's it.
Great segue to the next question, actually.
Okay, I just wanted to mention, though, that on the small side of research, one of the best kinds of research that we really encourage people in the ongoing product life cycle is to do ongoing consultation with their users. So that might take the form of usability day once a month. We do a couple of hours every morning. Our budget's spent on donuts, and we get in anybody who we can. It's just a case of making it part of the process and keeping it small on an ongoing basis.
Surveys is a little trickier.
Mm-hmm.
The surveys we do are not quantitative, so they are qualitative, much like the other methods, and intended to generate insights. And so deciding whether you're going to stop after 200 people have responded fully, or whether you're going to stop after a week is against all of the same factors that Stephen just mentioned, like budget and time available, et cetera, et cetera.
So that's a big question, how to scope your research.
Right.
How long is a piece of string?
Yeah. So I hope we've provided enough of an answer to that one.
Yeah.
No, it's that maddening old, it depends.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. So again, back to sort of that whole big budget piece.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that came in is how much, in terms of the budget, does the recruiting piece take up? Percentage, potentially.
Yeah, it's not. So you pay two things. So you pay an incentive usually, and then you pay the recruiter a recruitment fee per head. And so typically for us, it's, I'd say 20%. It's low, like it's not a massive amount of it, of the cost. Facility actually adds up much faster. And we find a lot of our clients are opting for remote because the facility cost is a bit prohibitive.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it's in that 20% range.
Mm-hmm. So there's another question that came in. It's, are you able to recruit within your own organization, or does that add bias? So I'm going to assume that he means within his brand organization.
It really depends what you're testing, right? So if you're testing an employee system, you've got exactly the right people.
Right, right.
But if you're talking about something that's going out to your customer base or membership base or whatever, better to test with someone than no one, for sure. Even if there is some bias there, you're still going to get findings. The other interesting thing is how many findings can you get that you can actually act on is an important factor. So even if you say, when it comes to a usability test, if you find 5 big things that are wrong with it, that are stumbling blocks in the interface, you probably just need to fix those 5 and move on and then do another test. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Terry talked about evaluative versus generative research. If we're talking about generative, or we're looking to get input and ideas, then you don't want the bias. If we're talking evaluative, that bias may disappear, maybe less of an issue, because if you're assessing, can you sign up for this service? It doesn't necessarily matter as much whether you're an insider or not.
They're still going to find issues, for sure, as long as they weren't directly involved in the project. I think that's important. And then, of course, if you can go to people who represent your end users, people who are really your end users, all the better. But if you can't, test with somebody.
So one of the things we often do in evaluative research is to look at people's understanding of the labels and the organization of things. And that's where bias can throw you off. If people are familiar with the internal jargon at a company, they know the telco language, for example, they're not going to pick up on the fact that most people have no idea what they mean by SMB or some other acronym.
Yeah, right. Good point. Okay. Another great question has come in from Sarah. During usability testing, if you don't stick to the script, will it affect the results?
Yeah, I guess you're sticking to the spirit rather than the letter of the law kind of thing. So you do still need to get enough people through each task and each interface that you want feedback on. That's why you test with multiple people, is that you want to make sure that it's not an anomaly. While I've said, it's a guide, and I think that's really true, you do need to get people, sometimes you need to purposely get them back on track.
Mm-hmm. So the script itself for your plan for the session is really a good framework, but you need some flexibility in that. You want to allow people to go off and explore in ways that are natural to them, but that you've got this framework for drawing them back in. You can pull them back in so that you haven't gone off crazy off script. You've still got your data around the points that you're looking for, but you try and do it in the most naturalistic way and allow somebody to provide some peripheral color and some of their own things that they think are important.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on preparing a script? Does it differ for a phone call interview or face-to-face interviews?
Well, because we don't want to be slavish to our scripts, typically not.
Yeah, the scripts are not that drastically different.
No.
Yeah.
It's really the framework that your conversation is going to be built upon rather than verbatim steps along the way. But if there are particular oddities to your setup, that's where it becomes specific. Like, somebody has to have a headset or need some instructions on using a particular piece of equipment for your study. That's where it's different. Less so than the in-person versus over the phone question.
Yeah, but basically you usually have, 4 or 5 key topics that you're trying to explore with someone, and then a number of questions associated with each of those topics. So you just want to make sure you hit all of those topics, again, whether you're in person or by phone.
Okay. I have one more great question, and we'll try to answer the rest through the blog post. One of the attendees is conducting research on mental health issues. He's interviewing parents, and the conversations are very sensitive.
Yes.
Parents started crying. Mm-hmm. How do we deal with these sensitivities?
So when we've had to do very sensitive research, which we have done a number of ones, that we will usually anticipate that it's sensitive, and that will influence the method that we'll use right off the bat. And we'll prepare ourselves for the eventuality that someone is going to become uncomfortable or going to break down or whatever it might be. And again, try to be, I guess the way I would describe it is try to be really present and actively listening to them, giving them a way out for sure. If they decide that they don't want to continue, that's absolute must, that they should be let off the hook instantly.
We always, when conducting research, allow people and state up front that if, for any reason you need to take a break or end our session, that's fine, just let us know. But when it's sensitive like this, we especially need to prepare for those interruptions and allow for them. And that if somebody is, that's in and of itself is data. That, if somebody is having that degree of emotional reaction, that's a cue to something to watch for. And when we're doing sessions, we're always watching for nonverbal cues, and that's about as strong a nonverbal cue as you can get. Somebody having a breakdown and needing a pause, but they're telling you something very, very important when that happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to cheat. We're actually going to try to answer one more question because it hasn't come up in the conversation yet, and I think it's worth mentioning this. What is the value of specialized software like eye tracking in usability research? Necessary, not necessary, nice to have?
Well, we've debated that a lot internally, and I think where we've seen it seem to make the most effective impact is where it's used in combination with other methods that are capturing the why question and not just the what. The part of the trouble that with something, a technology that's so specific as eye tracking is that it can be really good about pointing out some whats, but not very good about the why.
We know what they're looking at, but we don't know why, and we don't know what behavior emanates from it. So that's, I think, what Stephen's getting at, is that you wouldn't want just the eye tracking information. You'd want to know where their eye went, but also then what did they do on that page is super important. So we have not used it for that very reason, is that it doesn't. It just provides information about where someone looks, but we care more about what they do.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. There were a few more questions. Again, we'll answer those via the blog post. The time is up and we want to respect that. Everyone's got other things to do. Thanks again, everybody, for listening in. As promised, we will follow up with an email where we will share a link. You can download the full recording of this webinar as well as the slides. That fantastic checklist referenced by Stephen, that will also be linked into the email. You can check that out and be sure to download it and keep it handy for any sort of UX research you've got coming up. All right, so Usability Matters is dedicated to sharing great content and resources with our community. This article, 3 easy ways to improve the accessibility of your website, is a recent post. Please go in and to our website and check it out. Again, it is one of the many resources on our website, and it also if you keep coming to our website, you'll be sure to know what upcoming events are on their way. Stay in touch. We want to hear from you. You can also follow us and message us on all the usual social media channels. We'll be sure to respond promptly. Have a fantastic rest of the day, everyone, and thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.